In the bustling heart of Baltimore, a seemingly ordinary morning transforms into an extraordinary stand for justice. Lillian Baker, a quiet yet resolute woman in her 70s, boards a city bus, unaware that a simple act of defiance will soon ripple across her community and beyond. When the bus driver, Henry Walker, singles her out and demands she move to the back, Lillian refuses to bow to prejudice. Her decision ignites a tense confrontation, witnessed by a bus full of passengers, some too afraid to speak out, others finding courage in her unwavering resolve. But what begins as a single moment of defiance soon spirals into something far greater. A teenager offers an unexpected act of kindness. A young man's camera captures the truth, and a retired bus driver breaks his silence about years of injustice. As the story unfolds, Lillian becomes the heart of a growing movement, inspiring others to confront systemic inequities and reclaim their voices. What follows is a journey of resilience and transformation, a courtroom battle, community rallies, and a groundswell of support that challenges not only a system, but the apathy that allows injustice to thrive. At its core, this is a story of courage in the face of adversity, of quiet acts of kindness becoming a powerful force for change. The early morning sun bathed the narrow streets of downtown Baltimore in a golden glow, though the winter chill still clung stubbornly to the air. Lillian Baker stood at the corner of Elm Street, her gloved hands clutching a well-worn leather purse. The city's rhythmic hum carried on around her, cars honking, pedestrians rushing past, and the faint melody of a street performer's saxophone in the distance. For Lillian, these moments before her daily bus ride had always been a time for quiet reflection. Her apartment, a modest second-story unit in a creaky brick building, was only a short walk away. It was small but tidy, with potted plants lining the windowsills and framed photographs of her late husband, George, and their children decorating the walls. The walls carried the scent of lavender, a tribute to George, who had always loved its calming aroma. Though the space often felt too quiet, it was her sanctuary, a testament to a life built on resilience. As Lillian waited for the bus, her mind wandered to the community meeting she was heading to that day. The local council was discussing senior-friendly transit options, and Lillian had made it her mission to advocate for those often overlooked. After all, she had spent decades ensuring her family thrived despite systemic barriers. Now that her children were grown and thriving in other cities, she turned her attention to helping others in her community. The bus pulled up with a loud groan, its brakes squealing as it came to a stop. Lillian adjusted her scarf, climbed aboard, and greeted the driver, Henry Walker, with a polite nod. Henry barely acknowledged her, his scowl deepening as she dropped coins into the fare box. "Move along," he barked, his voice curt. Lillian said nothing, letting his rudeness roll off her like rain off an umbrella. She had endured far worse in her lifetime. Her brown eyes scanned the seats near the front, where she usually sat to avoid standing for the ride. Her knees, weathered by age, ached if she stood for too long. Spotting an open seat, she made her way down the narrow aisle. "You cannot sit there," Henry called out sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of passengers. Lillian froze, turning to meet his gaze. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said. "Seats up front are not for you. Move to the back." A hush fell over the bus. Passengers glanced away, their discomfort palpable. Lillian felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders, a weight she thought she had shed long ago. But she steadied herself, straightened her spine, and looked him in the eye. "I paid my fare like everyone else," she said evenly. "I will sit where I please." Henry's face reddened. He slammed the brakes, causing passengers to jolt forward and cling to the nearest pole or seat. Lillian gripped the cold metal rail to steady herself. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "You are causing a scene," he snapped. "Move, or I will call security." Lillian did not move. "Then call them," she replied calmly. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. A young girl seated nearby, no older than 16, shifted uncomfortably before speaking up. "She is not doing anything wrong," the girl said quietly, her voice trembling. She turned to Lillian and added softly, You should stay. The girl's unexpected words struck Lillian. She looked at the teenager, whose auburn hair framed a freckled face full of quiet defiance. Lillian offered her a small nod of thanks. In that moment, the girl's kindness fortified her resolve. Another voice joined in, this time from the middle of the bus. A man in his 20s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, raised his phone, its camera light glowing faintly. I am recording this, he announced. People need to see how you are treating her. Henry's glare shifted to the young man. Turn that off, he growled. Not a chance, the man replied, leaning back in his seat. The murmurs of discontent among the passengers grew louder. An older woman with a crocheted scarf wrapped around her neck spoke next. She's just trying to sit. Why are you making such a fuss? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Henry's face twisted with frustration. I'll make the rules on this bus, he snapped. And if anyone does not like it, they can get off. Lillian's pulse quickened as the driver grabbed his radio to call for security. Despite the chaos, she felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her. The small acts of kindness, the teenager's encouragement, the young man's bold recording, and the older woman's quiet defense were like buoyant forces lifting her above the fray. She turned to the passengers, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. This is not just about me, she said, her words carrying across the bus. It is about what is right. No one deserves to be treated this way. Henry slammed the radio down, his frustration boiling over. You are disturbing everyone here, he shouted. People are trying to get to work. A young mother near the back spoke up, her toddler balanced on her lap. She is not the one holding us up, the woman said. You are. The bus fell into a stunned silence. Even Henry seemed momentarily taken aback. Moments later, the faint sound of sirens pierced the air. Lillian looked out the window and saw a transit authority vehicle pulling up behind the bus. The sight of the officers approaching sent a wave of unease through the passengers, but Lillian's resolve remained unshaken. As the bus doors hissed open and the officers stepped inside, the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Lillian held her ground, her hands gripping the silver rail beside her seat. The officers turned to Henry, who wasted no time pointing at Lillian. She is refusing to comply, he said. I need her off the bus. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Lillian. Ma'am, he said, his tone measured. Can you explain what is going on? Lillian met his gaze, her voice calm but resolute. I paid my fare. I followed every rule. But the driver here has decided I do not belong in this seat. The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Henry interjected, his frustration spilling over. These are priority seats, he barked. She does not qualify. Priority for whom? Lillian asked sharply. The elderly? I believe I fit the bill. A murmur of agreement rippled through the bus. The young man with the phone aimed his camera at the officer. You guys better do the right thing, he said. This is all being recorded. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather, their curious faces peering through the bus's windows. Lillian could hear faint murmurs of the growing crowd and the clicking of cameras. The tension in the air was palpable, but Lillian felt an unexpected sense of calm. She thought of the teenager who had spoken up, the young man recording, and the older woman who had defended her. Their kindness had reminded her of something she had always believed but had sometimes forgotten. Change begins with courage, and courage is often contagious. As the sirens wailed in the background and the officers deliberated, Lillian straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. This was no longer just her fight. It was a stand for something far greater. The low hum of the bus's engine reverberated through the tense silence. Lillian sat tall, her hands steady on the silver rail beside her seat. The transit authority officer stood between her and the driver's seething glare. The officer closest to Lillian hesitated, his expression caught between protocol and the eyes of the gathering crowd outside. Henry Walker, the bus driver, broke the silence with a sneering laugh. Are we just going to stand here all day? He barked. She's holding up the whole route. Do your job. The officer raised a hand to calm him. Sir, we need to de-escalate this, he said evenly, though his tone carried an edge of impatience. He turned back to Lillian. Ma'am, I understand how you feel, but moving to another seat might be the easiest way to resolve this. Lillian's lips tightened, but she remained composed. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing the injustices she had weathered throughout her life. "And what message does that send?" she replied, her voice steady. "That if someone decides I don't belong, I should just step aside? I won't do it." From the middle of the bus, Jake Torres, the young man with the phone, leaned forward. "She's got a point," he said. "She's not the one making a scene here." Henry turned his glare on Jake. "Put that phone away," he snapped, jabbing a finger in Jake's direction. "This doesn't concern you." Jake didn't budge. "You made it everyone's business the moment you stopped the bus," he shot back. Behind him, Margaret Simmons, the older woman with the crocheted scarf, chimed in. "You should listen to her," she said firmly, nodding toward Lillian. "She's not asking for anything unreasonable." A ripple of agreement stirred among the passengers. A teenage girl sitting across the aisle, the same girl who had spoken earlier, raised her voice again. "It's ridiculous," she said. "She has every right to sit here." Henry's face flushed crimson, his anger barely restrained. "All of you just sit down and mind your business," he roared, slamming a fist against the steering wheel for emphasis. The sound startled a young mother near the back, who instinctively pulled her toddler closer. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered, glancing nervously at Lillian. Lillian turned her gaze toward the mother, her expression softening. "Sometimes standing up for what's right makes people uncomfortable," she said, her tone gentle yet firm. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." The mother hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. Outside the bus, the crowd continued to grow. Some passersby took out their phones to record the scene. Others leaned in to ask bystanders what was happening. A small chant began to rise, disjointed at first, but growing more unified with each passing moment. "Let her seat! Let her seat!" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They were no longer just dealing with a bus dispute. They were facing the court of public opinion. The officer who had spoken to Lillian earlier sighed deeply and addressed the passengers. "We're trying to resolve this peacefully," he said, though his words did little to calm the restless energy in the bus. Jake turned his phone toward the window, capturing the growing crowd. "This is bigger than just this bus now," he said to no one in particular. "People are paying attention." The tension inside the bus was thick, but moments of quiet defiance began to shine through. The teenage girl reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook. She flipped to an empty page and began scribbling furiously. After a few moments, she tore out the page, folded it neatly, and handed it to Lillian. "I wrote this for you," she said softly. Lillian unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the neat, blocky handwriting. "You inspire me. Thank you for standing up for yourself and for all of us. Don't let anyone tell you where you belong." Lillian felt a lump rise in her throat. She met the girl's gaze and offered a small, heartfelt smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. Moments later, another unexpected kindness emerged. Alyssa Grant, the young mother with the toddler, rummaged through her diaper bag and pulled out a small, rolled-up blanket. She approached Lillian hesitantly, holding it out. "I thought you might be more comfortable with this," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Lillian accepted the blanket with a gracious nod. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said. "Thank you." These small acts of kindness, seemingly insignificant on their own, began to weave together a tapestry of solidarity. Lillian felt her resolve strengthen with each gesture, as if the passenger's support were fortifying her against the storm brewing in front of her. Henry, meanwhile, was growing more agitated by the minute. His jaw tightened as he watched the officers deliberate near the front of the bus. "What's there to talk about?" he barked. "She's disrupting my route. Get her off already." The officer turned to him sharply. "Sir, you need to lower your voice," he said. "We're trying to handle this appropriately." Jake, still recording, let out a low chuckle. "This guy's digging his own grave," he muttered, earning a few murmurs of agreement from nearby passengers. Margaret spoke again, her tone measured but firm. "Driver, you're the only one making this harder than it needs to be. Let the woman sit, so we can all get on with our day." As the minutes ticked by, The crowd outside began to grow louder. The chant of "Let her sit" gained momentum, its rhythm echoing through the open bus doors. Lillian glanced out the window, her heart swelling at the sight of so many strangers rallying to her defense. She turned to the officers and said calmly, "I think the people have spoken." The officer nearest her let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am," he said, "are you absolutely sure you're not willing to move? This whole thing could end right now." Lillian met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I am sure," she said. "If I move, he'll think he can treat others this way, and he'll keep doing it. Someone has to tell him no." The officer nodded slowly, as if recognizing the truth in her words. He turned to his partner and whispered something inaudible. The second officer glanced at Henry, then at the passengers, before finally nodding in agreement. "All right," the first officer said, his tone resigned but respectful. "You can stay where you are, ma'am." Henry exploded. "What?" he shouted, his voice cracking with outrage. "You're just going to let her get away with this?" The officer's tone hardened. "Driver, that's enough," he said. "If you can't control yourself, we'll have to take further action." The passengers erupted in applause, their collective relief breaking the tension that had gripped the bus. Lillian allowed herself a small smile, though she knew the battle was far from over. The officer turned to her again. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quieter now, "we'll make sure this gets properly documented. You're not alone in this." For the first time in years, Lillian felt a deep sense of validation, as if her years of quiet endurance had finally been acknowledged. She nodded at the officer, then glanced at the passengers who had rallied around her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. "Thank you all." As the bus lurched forward once more, the crowd's chants faded into the distance, but their impact lingered. Lillian felt a flicker of hope, one that would only grow stronger in the days to come. The bus finally lurched forward, its low rumble punctuated by the murmurs of passengers. Though the morning commute resumed, the atmosphere on the bus was far from ordinary. Conversations bubbled to life, whispers growing louder as people recounted what they had just witnessed. Some turned to Lillian, offering smiles of support or quiet nods of approval. Others remained silent, their eyes darting to Henry Walker, who sat fuming in the driver's seat. Lillian clutched the rolled-up blanket Alyssa Grant had given her. Its warmth seemed to settle her frayed nerves as she gazed out the window. She was still processing what had happened, the confrontation, the unexpected support from strangers, and the growing crowd outside. Her pulse was finally beginning to slow, but her mind raced. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, but she had never expected her actions to draw such attention. The words of the teenage girl who had handed her the note echoed in her mind. "You inspire me. Don't let anyone tell you where you belong." The bus came to a stop a few blocks later, and the young man with the phone, Jake Torres, rose from his seat. As he passed by Lillian, he paused. "I'm uploading this video as soon as I get off," he said. His tone carried a mix of defiance and determination. "People need to see what happened here." Lillian hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. "Do you think it will make a difference?" she asked softly. Jake smiled faintly. "You already made the difference," he said before stepping off the bus. By the time Lillian reached the community center for her meeting, the incident had already begun to spread. Jake's video, shaky but clear, captured the entire ordeal, from Henry's heated demands to Lillian's calm defiance and the passengers who stood by her side. Within an hour, it was shared across social media platforms, gaining traction with every passing minute. Lillian arrived at the small meeting room on the second floor of the center, still clutching her purse and blanket. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and community advocates she had worked with over the years. They greeted her warmly, but as she settled into her usual spot near the front, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Angela Morton, the meeting's organizer, approached her with wide eyes. "Lillian," she said, her voice hushed but urgent, "I just saw the video. Is it true? Did that really happen to you this morning?" Lillian nodded slowly. "It's true," she said. "I wasn't looking for trouble, Angela. I just wanted to sit." Angela's expression softened. She placed a hand on Lillian's shoulder. "What you did was brave," she said. "That driver had no right to treat you that way." Lillian sighed, the weight of the morning's events settling over her. I didn't feel brave, she admitted. I just couldn't let him think he could treat people like that. Angela pulled out her phone and scrolled through the comments beneath Jake's video. Look at this, she said, handing it to Lillian. The screen was filled with messages of support. Thank you, ma'am, for standing your ground. She's a hero. This is why we need to speak up when we see injustice. Lillian's heart swelled as she read the words. Though she had spent much of her life quietly enduring the small and large indignities of systemic prejudice, seeing so many strangers rally to her side felt like a balm to old wounds. That evening, Lillian returned to her apartment, exhausted but unable to rest. Her small living room, with its cozy armchair and shelves lined with books, felt quieter than usual. She prepared a cup of chamomile tea and sank into her chair, staring out the window at the streetlights flickering in the distance. Her phone buzzed on the side table. She reached for it, expecting a call from one of her children. Instead, the screen displayed an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered. Mrs. Baker? A confident female voice asked. Yes, this is she, Lillian replied, her voice cautious. This is Gloria Hartman, the caller said. I'm a civil rights attorney here in Baltimore. I just saw the video of what happened to you today, and I felt compelled to reach out. Lillian sat up straighter, her hand tightening around the phone. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I wasn't expecting this much attention. I can imagine, Gloria said gently. But this isn't just about you. What happened today struck a nerve because it's part of a bigger problem. I believe you have a strong case, not just against the driver, but also against the transit authority. If you're willing, I'd like to represent you. Lillian's mind raced. The idea of legal action had never crossed her mind. She had spent her life avoiding unnecessary conflict, focusing instead on raising her family and contributing to her community. But Gloria's words stirred something in her, a sense of duty, not just to herself, but to others who might face similar treatment. I'll need some time to think about it, Lillian said finally. Of course, Gloria replied. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm here to help, whatever you decide. As Lillian ended the call, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The day had left her shaken, but it had also ignited a spark she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Lillian awoke to a flood of notifications on her phone. Jake's video had gone viral, amassing thousands of views overnight. News outlets began reaching out for interviews, and hashtags like Justice for Lillian and Stand with Lillian trended across social media. Her eldest daughter, Monica, called from Atlanta, her voice brimming with both pride and concern. Mama, I saw the video, she said. Are you okay? I'm fine, Monica, Lillian assured her. Just overwhelmed. You were incredible, Monica said. You stood up for yourself. For all of us. Lillian felt a lump rise in her throat. I wasn't trying to make a statement, she said. I just wanted to be treated with dignity. And that's exactly why it matters, Monica replied. People need to see that standing up is possible. As the call ended, Lillian's resolve solidified. She reached for the phone and dialed the number Gloria had given her. Ms. Hartman, she said when the attorney picked up, I've made my decision. I'd like you to represent me. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Gloria filed an official complaint against Henry Walker and the Transit Authority, citing both the viral video and witness testimonies as evidence. Reporters began showing up at Lillian's door, eager to hear her story. Though the attention made her uneasy, she realized the importance of using her voice. In her first televised interview, Lillian sat in a modest chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She spoke calmly but passionately about the events of that day and the broader issues they represented. I'm not looking for revenge, she said. I'm looking for accountability. No one should have to question their worth or their right to exist in shared spaces. The interview aired that evening, sparking even more conversations across the city and beyond. Strangers sent her letters of support, while local activists organized rallies demanding reform within the Transit Authority. Lillian's quiet life had been upended, but for the first time, she felt she was stepping into a purpose she hadn't fully realized before. The kindness of strangers had propelled her forward, and she was determined to make their belief in her count. Lillian sat at her kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window onto the neatly arranged stacks of letters that had arrived over the past few days. Some came from friends and neighbors, but most were from complete strangers. Each envelope carried messages of encouragement, solidarity, and gratitude for her courage. She picked up a card with elegant cursive handwriting and read aloud to herself. "Dear Mrs. Baker, thank you for standing up. People like you remind us that even the smallest acts of defiance can change the world." Her fingers lingered over the words. She had never seen herself as someone who could inspire others. She simply did what she believed was right. But now, the weight of this collective hope and expectation pressed gently on her shoulders, urging her forward. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Gloria Hartman. "Good morning, Mrs. Baker," Gloria greeted, her tone brisk yet warm. "I have some updates. Do you have time to go over them today?" Lillian nodded, even though Gloria couldn't see her. "Yes, of course," she said. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "I'll come by your place in an hour," Gloria said. "We need to discuss the transit authority's response and strategize our next steps." After hanging up, Lillian glanced around her apartment. The familiar space, with its lavender-scented air and photos of her late husband George, seemed to echo with a steady voice. George had always been her compass, a man who believed in justice and fairness. She touched the edge of his framed photo and whispered, "I hope I'm making you proud." An hour later, Gloria arrived, carrying a slim briefcase and an air of focused determination. She wore a navy blazer, her sharp posture conveying confidence and authority. Lillian welcomed her in and poured 2 cups of tea, setting one on the table for Gloria. "Thank you," Gloria said, taking a sip before diving in. "The Transit Authority has issued a statement. It's, well, predictably hollow." She pulled out a printed copy and read aloud. "We regret the incident involving Mrs. Baker and are reviewing our policies to ensure fairness and inclusivity moving forward." Lillian's lips pressed into a thin line. "Regret doesn't undo what happened," she said softly. "And reviewing policies feels like empty words." Gloria nodded. "That's exactly what it is. They're hoping the public outcry dies down before they're forced to take real action." She leaned forward, her voice steady. "But here's the good news. The video, your interview, and the growing support from the community are making it impossible for them to sweep this under the rug. They know they're being watched." Lillian absorbed this, her thoughts swirling. "What happens next?" she asked. "Next, we build our case," Gloria replied. She pulled out a notepad and pen. "I've already filed the formal complaint against Henry Walker and the Transit Authority. Now we need witness statements and any additional evidence that can show this wasn't an isolated incident." Lillian hesitated. "Do you think people will come forward?" "I do," Gloria said firmly. "In fact, a few already have." Over the next week, the pieces began to fall into place. Gloria arranged for witnesses from the bus to meet with her, each one recounting their perspective on the events of that morning. The teenage girl, Emma Green, was one of the first to step forward. She arrived at Gloria's office with her parents, clutching the notebook she had used to write Lillian her note. Her nervous energy filled the room, but when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet conviction. "I saw everything," Emma said, looking directly at Gloria. The driver was yelling at her for no reason. She was just sitting there. Gloria nodded, jotting down notes. "What made you speak up?" she asked. Emma glanced at Lillian, who sat beside Gloria. "Because it wasn't fair," she said simply. "And because I knew if no one said anything, he'd think he could get away with it." Lillian reached out and squeezed Emma's hand. "You were braver than most adults that day," she said softly. "Thank you." Another witness, Margaret Simmons, shared her story next. She had been hesitant to speak up on the bus, but the viral video had given her the courage to come forward. "I've seen him act that way before," Margaret admitted. "It's always subtle snide comments, rude behavior, but that day, it wasn't subtle at all. It was cruel." Gloria's pen paused. "You've seen this behavior from him before?" she asked. Margaret nodded. "I've been writing his route for years. He always targets people who look different or seem vulnerable." This testimony was a breakthrough. Gloria leaned back, her mind already piecing together how to use it in court. "Thank you, Margaret. This is important." The most surprising witness came from an unexpected source. John Davis, a retired bus driver who had worked alongside Henry Walker for decades, reached out after seeing the news coverage. "I never liked the way Henry treated people," John said during a meeting at Gloria's office. He thought he was untouchable because the transit authority always backed him up. They'd get complaints, but nothing ever stuck. Lillian listened intently, her heart pounding. "Why are you coming forward now?" she asked. John sighed heavily. "Because I stayed quiet too long," he said. "And watching that video, seeing you stand up to him, it made me realize I can't keep quiet anymore." Gloria smiled, her respect for John evident. "Your testimony could make all the difference," she said. "Thank you for speaking out." As the case grew stronger, so did the public support for Lillian. Community leaders organized a rally outside the Transit Authority's headquarters, demanding transparency and systemic reform. Lillian, though overwhelmed by the attention, attended the rally at Gloria's urging. The sight that greeted her left her breathless. Hundreds of people filled the square, holding signs that read "Justice for Lillian" and "End Transit Discrimination." Emma stood near the front, holding a sign she had made herself. "Courage is contagious." The crowd erupted into cheers when Lillian stepped onto the small platform set up for speakers. She gripped the microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I didn't stand up that day because I wanted attention," she began. "I stood up because I was tired of being treated like I didn't matter. And I'm standing here today because I know I'm not alone." Applause rippled through the crowd, giving her the confidence to continue. "This fight isn't just about me," she said. "It's about every person who has ever been made to feel small or unworthy. Together, we can demand better. Together, we can create change." The cheers were deafening as Lillian stepped back from the microphone, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. She had found her voice, and she knew it was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Lillian Baker stepped through its double doors, flanked by Gloria Hartman and a small group of supporters. The air was heavy with the anticipation of the first hearing against Henry Walker and the Transit Authority. Lillian adjusted her scarf as she walked, the soft material a comfort against the brisk morning chill still lingering in the courthouse. The proceedings had drawn considerable attention. Reporters lined the courthouse steps outside, their cameras clicking as Lillian had arrived earlier that morning. Now inside, the gallery was filled to capacity, community members, supporters, and witnesses eager to see justice unfold. Lillian scanned the room, her gaze settling briefly on Henry Walker, who sat at the defense table with his lawyer. He avoided her eyes, his jaw tight, and his hands clasped on the table. For a fleeting moment, Lillian felt the familiar tug of intimidation. But then she glanced at Gloria, whose calm confidence radiated like a lighthouse beacon, and the doubt faded. The judge called the room to order, and Gloria began her opening statement. Her voice was steady and deliberate, each word carefully chosen to underscore the gravity of the case. "Your Honor, this is not merely a case about a single incident of mistreatment," Gloria said, her gaze sweeping across the jury. "It is about a pattern of behavior, a culture of discrimination within a system designed to serve the public. My client, Mrs. Lillian Baker, paid her fare like every other passenger. She followed every posted rule. Yet she was treated as though she did not belong. And when she stood her ground, she was threatened, humiliated, and physically removed from her seat." Lillian felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest as Gloria continued, her words both piercing and compassionate. "Today, we ask this court not only to hold the defendant, Mr. Walker, accountable for his actions, but to demand better from the system that enabled him." The jury listened intently, their faces a mixture of curiosity and resolve. Lillian could see that Gloria's words were resonating, and it gave her a small spark of hope. The first witnesses were called to the stand. Emma Green, the teenage girl who had stood up for Lillian on the bus, was among the first to testify. She looked nervous as she took her seat, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. But when Gloria approached with a gentle smile, Emma seemed to relax. "Emma," Gloria began, her tone kind but professional, "can you tell the court what you witnessed on the morning of the incident?" Emma nodded, her voice soft but clear. "The driver told Mrs. Baker she couldn't sit near the front. He was yelling at her, and it didn't make any sense. She wasn't doing anything wrong. "And what made you decide to speak up?" Gloria asked. Emma hesitated, glancing at Lillian before answering. "Because I thought about my grandmother," she said. "She's around Mrs. Baker's age, and I couldn't imagine someone treating her like that. I had to say something." Her words struck a chord, and Lillian's eyes glistened as she offered Emma a small, encouraging nod. Next, Jake Torres took the stand. His testimony was bolstered by the video he had recorded, which was played for the courtroom. The footage showed the entire confrontation in vivid detail: Henry's angry demands, Lillian's calm defiance, and the growing solidarity among the passengers. When the video ended, the room was silent for a moment. Even the defense seemed momentarily stunned by the clear evidence of Henry's actions. "Jake," Gloria said, resuming her questioning, "why did you decide to record this incident?" Jake shrugged slightly, his tone matter of fact. "Because I've seen things like this happen before. People like Henry get away with it because no one speaks up. I wanted to make sure this time was different." "And do you believe your actions made a difference?" Gloria asked. Jake glanced at Lillian, his expression softening. "Yeah, but Mrs. Baker is the real reason this mattered." She didn't back down. The most damning testimony came from John Davis, the retired bus driver who had worked with Henry for years. As he recounted instances of Henry's previous misconduct and the transit authorities' lack of action, the jury's expressions shifted disbelief, giving way to indignation. "I reported him once," John admitted, "but nothing came of it. They told me to focus on my route and leave the rest to management." "And what message did that send?" Gloria asked. John sighed heavily. That drivers like Henry could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Gloria let his words hang in the air before turning to the jury. "This is the culture we are challenging today." When it was Lillian's turn to take the stand, she felt her nerves tighten. The eyes of the courtroom bore down on her, each gaze a silent question. But as she met Gloria's steady eyes, her confidence returned. "Mrs. Baker," Gloria began, her voice soft but firm, "can you tell the court why you refused to move to the back of the bus that day?" Lillian straightened her posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Because it wasn't just about the seat," she said. "It was about dignity, about being treated as an equal. I've spent my whole life trying to prove that I deserve to be where I am. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need to prove it anymore. I knew I belonged." Her words resonated deeply. Several jurors nodded almost imperceptibly, and Gloria allowed a moment of silence before continuing. "What do you hope will come from this case?" she asked. Lillian's voice grew stronger. "I hope this sends a message that people like Henry can't hide behind their positions of power, that no one deserves to feel small or unworthy, and that standing up even when it's hard can lead to change." The defense's cross-examination was pointed, but it failed to rattle Lillian. She countered each question with calm composure, refusing to let her confidence waver. By the time she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom felt charged with unspoken energy. As the day's proceedings came to an end, Lillian walked out of the courthouse alongside Gloria. The crowd outside erupted into cheers as they emerged, their chants of justice for Lillian echoing through the air. Emma ran up to Lillian, holding out a small bouquet of daisies. "These are for you," she said shyly. Lillian accepted the flowers, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Emma," she said. "You don't know how much this means to me." As she looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had come together because of one moment on a city bus, Lillian felt a profound sense of hope. She had always believed in the power of kindness and resilience, but now she could see it unfolding before her, rippling outward like waves in a pond. The fight wasn't over, but Lillian knew she wasn't standing alone. Together, they were creating something bigger than any one person, something that could last. The courthouse was quiet now, its once bustling halls empty as the jury deliberated. Lillian sat in a small conference room with Gloria Hartman, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights filling the silence. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her thumb absently tracing the edge of her wedding ring. It was a habit she had developed in moments of uncertainty, a silent conversation with George, whose memory often felt closer in times like this. The trial's intensity had left her drained, but the stillness of waiting was somehow worse. Her thoughts swirled with everything that had happened from the moment Henry Walker barked at her on the bus to the testimony of witnesses who had shared their own stories of injustice. She had never imagined that a simple act of defiance could ripple outward, pulling so many people into its current. "Mrs. Baker," Gloria said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her eyes revealed a flicker of concern. "How are you holding up?" Lillian managed a small smile. "I'm tired, Gloria," she admitted. "But I'm hopeful." Gloria nodded, her expression softening. "That hope is what brought us here," she said. "No matter what the verdict is, you've already made an impact. People are paying attention now." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered again, their signs waving like colorful flags in the afternoon breeze. Emma Green was there, as always, holding her handmade sign that read "Courage is contagious." She stood next to Jake Torres, whose phone was once again recording live footage of the scene. "This is bigger than just Mrs. Baker," Jake said into the camera, addressing his growing audience. "It's about holding people accountable. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Nearby, Margaret Simmons and John Davis were deep in conversation. Margaret held a paper cup of coffee, her crocheted scarf fluttering in the wind. "You did the right thing coming forward," Margaret told John. "We all did." John nodded, his brow furrowed. "It took me too long to speak up," he said. "But watching Mrs. Baker stand her ground, it reminded me that staying silent isn't an option anymore." Back inside, Gloria's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and straightened. "They're ready," she said. Lillian felt her chest tighten as she stood. Her knees wobbled slightly, but she steadied herself with a deep breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Together, she and Gloria made their way to the courtroom, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the empty hall. As they entered, the room was already filling with people. Henry Walker sat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. His face was pale, his once defiant expression now replaced with one of unease. The jury filed in moments later, their faces neutral but focused. The judge called the room to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his deep voice resonating through the courtroom. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of quiet authority, stood. She held a small piece of paper in her hands, her fingers steady as she spoke. "We have, Your Honor." Lillian's heart pounded as the foreperson began to read the verdict. "In the matter of Baker versus Walker, we find the defendant, Henry Walker, guilty of assault and misconduct." A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Lillian closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of relief washing over her like a wave. She felt Gloria's hand gently squeeze her arm. The foreperson continued, her voice firm. "We also find the Transit Authority liable for negligence in failing to address repeated complaints against Mr. Walker." This second verdict sent a louder wave of murmurs through the gallery. Lillian's eyes opened, and she found herself smiling a small but genuine expression of triumph. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. After the judge dismissed the court, Lillian remained seated for a moment, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She could hear the chatter around her, people celebrating, reporters preparing their stories, but it all felt distant, like background noise. Gloria leaned in close. "You did it," she said softly. "No," Lillian replied, her voice steady. "We did it." Gloria smiled and stood, motioning for Lillian to follow. As they exited the courtroom, the applause from the gallery grew louder. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers the moment they saw her. Emma ran up to Lillian, throwing her arms around her in a quick hug. "You're amazing, Mrs. Baker," Emma exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. Lillian chuckled, patting Emma's shoulder gently. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We were amazing." Jake stepped forward, lowering his phone for a rare moment. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Your story is everywhere. People are talking about real change." The celebration continued outside the courthouse for hours. Reporters crowded around Lillian, their microphones and cameras capturing her every word. "How do you feel about the verdict, Mrs. Baker?" one reporter asked. Lillian took a moment to gather her thoughts. I feel relieved, she said. But more importantly, I feel hopeful. This case wasn't just about me. It was about sending a message that no one is above accountability. That kindness, courage, and persistence can lead to change. Her words resonated with the crowd, their cheers swelling once again. Lillian felt the warmth of their support, a stark contrast to the isolation she had felt on the bus that fateful morning. That evening, Lillian returned to her apartment, her body weary but her spirit light. She placed the daisies Emma had given her in a small vase by the window and sank into her favorite armchair. The city lights twinkled outside, casting a soft glow over her living room. Her phone buzzed with a message from Gloria. We did it. Thank you for trusting me. Lillian smiled, her eyes welling with tears. She typed a simple reply. Thank you for believing in me. As she set the phone down, she looked at George's photo on the side table. We did it, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I hope you're proud. She closed her eyes, letting the events of the day sink in. The fight wasn't over. There were still reforms to push for, still stories to share. But for the first time in a long while, Lillian felt something she hadn't dared to feel before. She felt free. The morning after the verdict, Lillian Baker woke to sunlight streaming through her window. Her modest apartment, usually filled with quiet solitude, now felt alive with possibility. The daisies Emma had given her still sat in their vase, their petals glowing softly in the light. Lillian smiled as she rose, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen and saw dozens of messages, some from friends and family, others from people she didn't even know. One caught her eye, a text from Monica, her eldest daughter. Proud of you, Mama. You're changing the world. Lillian's chest swelled with warmth. Monica had always been her fiercest supporter, but hearing those words made her feel as if she were truly standing on the precipice of something bigger than herself. Later that morning, Gloria Hartman arrived with news. She entered the apartment with her usual air of efficiency, carrying a folder and a cup of coffee she'd picked up on the way. The transit authority is scrambling, Gloria said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. They've released a new statement, and this time, they're promising real reforms. Lillian sat down across from her, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. What kind of reforms? She asked cautiously. Gloria opened the folder and pulled out a printed copy of the statement. Mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, she read. An independent oversight committee to handle misconduct complaints. And they're revisiting their hiring practices to prioritize diversity and inclusion. Lillian raised an eyebrow. Do you believe them? Gloria hesitated, then shrugged. It's a start, she said, but promises mean little without action. That's why we're not done yet. Lillian nodded, her resolve firming. She had learned over the past weeks that change required persistence. It wasn't enough to win one battle. The war for fairness and dignity had to be fought every day. News of the verdict and the transit authority's proposed reforms spread quickly. Community leaders and activists hailed it as a victory, but many, like Gloria, viewed it as only the beginning. Calls for broader accountability grew louder, with rallies and town halls organized across the city. At one such town hall, Lillian was invited to speak. She hadn't planned to attend, preferring to let others take the lead, but Gloria insisted. People want to hear from you, Gloria said. You've become a symbol of resilience, Mrs. Baker. Your voice carries weight now. So, on a crisp Saturday afternoon, Lillian found herself standing on the stage of a crowded community center. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of admiration and expectation. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. First, let me say thank you. Thank you for standing with me, for raising your voices, and for showing the world that change is possible. The crowd erupted into applause, and Lillian waited for the noise to settle before continuing. I never wanted to be the center of attention, she said. But when I refused to move that day, it wasn't just about a seat on a bus. It was about something much bigger. It was about the belief that every person deserves respect, no matter their age, their race, or their status. She paused, scanning the room. This fight isn't over. The transit authority has made promises, but it's up to us to hold them accountable. Change doesn't happen because of one person, it happens because of all of us. As she stepped down from the podium, the crowd gave her a standing ovation. Emma Green was in the front row, clapping enthusiastically. Jake Torres stood nearby, his phone capturing the moment for his growing online audience. Even Margaret Simmons, usually quiet and reserved, shouted her approval. After the event, people lined up to speak with Lillian. Some shared their own stories of discrimination. Others simply thanked her for her courage. One young woman, a college student with a notebook tucked under her arm, asked for advice. "How do you stay so strong?" she asked, her voice tinged with awe. Lillian smiled gently. "Strength isn't something you're born with," she said. "It's something you build, piece by piece, with every challenge you face." The days that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings, and public appearances. Lillian's story continued to resonate, drawing attention from national media outlets and advocacy groups. She received invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and even a university panel on civil rights. One evening, after a long day of events, Lillian returned home to find a handwritten letter in her mailbox. She opened it carefully, her curiosity piqued. "Dear Mrs. Baker," it began, "I saw your story on the news, and it gave me the courage to speak up about something I've been afraid to address for years. Thank you for showing me that one voice can make a difference. You've inspired me more than words can say." The letter was unsigned, but it brought tears to Lillian's eyes. She realized that her actions had created a ripple effect far beyond what she could see. For every person who spoke out publicly, there were others whose lives had been quietly changed. At the same time, Henry Walker's life had taken a different turn. He had been sentenced to community service and ordered to attend anger management classes. His career as a bus driver was effectively over, and his name had become synonymous with the consequences of unchecked prejudice. Gloria kept Lillian updated on the legal reforms taking shape. The Independent Oversight Committee was already accepting applications, and Gloria had been invited to join as an advisor. She urged Lillian to consider applying as well. "You'd be a valuable voice on that committee," Gloria said during one of their meetings. "You understand the stakes better than anyone." Lillian hesitated. She had never seen herself as an activist or a policymaker. But as she reflected on the journey she had taken, she realized that her role in the fight for justice wasn't over. "I'll think about it," she said finally. 1 week later, Lillian sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "There's another rally tomorrow. Will you be there?" Lillian smiled and replied yes. "We're just getting started." As the day faded into night, Lillian felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought a hard battle and emerged stronger for it. And though the road ahead was long, she was ready to walk it with the support of her community, the strength of her convictions, and the quiet knowledge that even the smallest act of defiance could spark a revolution. The energy at the rally was electric. Lillian stood at the edge of the makeshift stage, watching as the crowd filled the park. Banners waved in the wind, painted with slogans like "Justice for All" and "Equality Now." Children sat on their parents' shoulders, clapping along to chants led by the crowd. The diversity of faces in the audience, young and old, from all walks of life, stirred something deep within her. Emma Green appeared by Lillian's side, holding her ever-present sign, "Courage is contagious." The teenager was beaming, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. "Are you ready, Mrs. Baker?" Emma asked, her voice full of enthusiasm. Lillian took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied with a small smile. Gloria Hartman gave Lillian a reassuring nod from behind the stage. The rally's organizers had asked Lillian to give the closing speech, a moment that would cap off weeks of protests, meetings, and demands for reform. It was daunting, but Lillian knew she couldn't turn back now. As she stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd. She looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying over the park. "It's humbling to see so many people here today, united for a cause that touches all of our lives. What happened to me on that bus was just one moment, but it revealed a truth that so many of us already know, that discrimination is still alive and well, and that it thrives when good people stay silent. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding their heads. But silence is no longer an option, Lillian continued. In the week since that day, I've seen something incredible. People coming together, speaking out and demanding change. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel small or invisible. Her voice grew stronger. Change isn't easy. It requires courage, persistence, and community. But together, we can create a world where dignity and respect are not privileges, but rights. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Lillian stepped back from the microphone, her heart pounding. Emma was the first to greet her with a hug. "You were amazing," Emma exclaimed. "That was exactly what we needed to hear." Lillian chuckled, brushing a tear from the corner of her eye. "I'm just trying to keep up with all of you," she said. After the rally, Lillian stayed to speak with attendees. Many shared their own stories of injustice, small moments that had left lasting scars. A young mother described being dismissed by a school administrator when advocating for her son. An elderly man spoke of being ignored in stores because of the color of his skin. Each story weighed on Lillian, but it also strengthened her resolve. As the crowd began to disperse, Lillian noticed Jake Torres near the stage, his camera pointed at her. He caught her eye and grinned. "Mrs. Baker," he said, lowering the camera. "That speech was fire. People online are going to eat it up." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Fire, huh? Is that what you kids call it these days?" Jake laughed. "You're a legend. Seriously." She shook her head with a smile. "I'm just a woman trying to make a difference." "And you are," Jake replied, his tone earnest. "More than you know." The momentum from the rally carried over into the following weeks. The Transit Authority began implementing the promised reforms, starting with mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. Gloria was appointed to the newly formed Oversight Committee, and Lillian decided to join as a community representative. Her first meeting with the committee was held in a sleek, glass-walled conference room downtown. Lillian felt out of place at first, surrounded by suits and laptops, but Gloria's presence beside her was a steadying force. The committee reviewed the changes underway and discussed future initiatives. Lillian listened intently, speaking up when necessary. Her contributions were measured but impactful, drawing from her lived experiences to ground the discussions in reality. "We can't just focus on training," Lillian said during one meeting. "There has to be accountability. If someone violates these policies, there need to be real consequences." Her words earned nods of agreement from around the table, and Gloria gave her an encouraging smile. Outside of her work with the committee, Lillian continued to receive invitations to speak at events and schools. At one high school, she met a group of students who had started their own initiative to combat bullying and discrimination on campus. Their enthusiasm reminded her of Emma, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of hope for the next generation. "You're the ones who will lead the way," Lillian told them during her visit. "Keep standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." One student, a shy girl with glasses, approached her afterward. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "Hearing your story makes me feel like I can make a difference too." "You can," Lillian said firmly. "Never doubt that." As the months passed, Lillian's life found a new rhythm. Her days were filled with committee meetings, speaking engagements, and community events. It was exhausting at times, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. The city buzzed quietly around her, a symphony of distant car horns and chirping crickets. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "You changed my life. Thank you for being you." Lillian smiled, her heart full. She typed a reply, "You've changed mine too, Emma. Keep being brave." As she set the phone down, she thought about the road that had brought her here, the bus ride, the courtroom, the rallies, and the people who had stood by her side. Each step had been a challenge, but it had also been an opportunity to grow, to connect, and to inspire. Lillian took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. The fight wasn't over, but she no longer feared what lay ahead. She had discovered strength she didn't know she had, and she had found hope in the kindness and courage of others. For the first time in years, Lillian felt that her life wasn't just a reflection of the past. It was a legacy in motion, built on resilience, shaped by kindness, and fueled by the unshakable belief that one voice could indeed make a difference. The hum of activity in the community center was infectious. Volunteers bustled about, setting up chairs and tables for the town hall meeting, their voices blending into a cheerful din. Lillian Baker stood near the front of the room, her hands clasped together as she surveyed the growing crowd. It amazed her to see how far things had come since that fateful day on the bus. What had begun as a single act of defiance had grown into a movement, and tonight's meeting was evidence of that. Gloria Hartman approached, her clipboard tucked under one arm and a look of quiet pride on her face. "The turnout is incredible," she said, gesturing toward the filled seats. "You've inspired a lot of people, Mrs. Baker." Lillian smiled, though she still felt a twinge of disbelief at her newfound role. "I'm just grateful people are willing to listen," she replied. "You've given them more than just a story to listen to," Gloria said. "You've given them hope." As the meeting began, Lillian took her seat at the head table alongside Gloria and several community leaders. A representative from the Transit Authority was also present, a young woman named Sarah Chambers who had been tasked with overseeing the agency's reforms. She wore a crisp suit and carried herself with a professional demeanor, but her nervousness was evident in the way she fidgeted with her pen. Gloria started the discussion, outlining the changes the Transit Authority had committed to and providing an update on their progress. Sarah spoke next, detailing the steps the agency was taking to address systemic issues, including hiring a more diverse workforce and implementing strict accountability measures. When it was Lillian's turn to speak, the room grew quiet. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience, her gaze lingering on familiar faces: Emma Green, Jake Torres, Margaret Simmons, and even John Davis, who gave her a small nod of encouragement from the second row. "I want to start by thanking everyone here," Lillian began, her voice steady but warm. "It's because of your voices, your persistence, and your belief in change that we're seeing progress today. But as proud as I am of what we've accomplished, I know there's still a long road ahead." She paused, letting her words sink in. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It's not just about new policies or committees. It's about a shift in how we treat each other every day, in every interaction. And that starts with all of us. The audience erupted into applause, and Lillian felt a swell of gratitude. She hadn't set out to lead a movement, but the connections she had made, the lives she had touched, were proof that her efforts were making a difference. After the meeting, people lingered to talk with Lillian. A young woman approached her, holding the hand of a boy no older than 6. "Mrs. Baker," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to thank you. What you've done has inspired me to speak up for my son. He has a disability, and I've spent years fighting for him to get the accommodations he needs in school. Seeing your courage has reminded me that I can't give up." Lillian crouched to meet the boy's eye level, offering him a warm smile. "Your mom's a fighter," she said gently. "And so are you." The boy grinned, and the woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Later that evening, Lillian returned home, her mind buzzing with the stories she had heard. She made herself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around her like a blanket. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world she was helping to shape. Her phone buzzed on the side table, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Emma. "Mrs. Baker, I've been thinking about what you said tonight. I want to do more. Do you think I could start a club at school to talk about these issues?" Lillian's heart swelled with pride as she typed her reply. "That's a wonderful idea, Emma. I'll help in any way I can." As she set the phone down, she thought about the ripple effect her actions had created. Emma's idea for a club, the young mother's renewed determination, the reforms at the Transit Authority, each was a testament to the power of standing up for what was right. What had started as a small spark was now a growing flame, spreading light in ways Lillian never could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, Lillian found herself busier than ever. She continued her work on the Oversight Committee, where her insights and lived experiences brought a vital perspective to the table. She also began mentoring young activists, including Emma, who had successfully launched her school club and invited Lillian to speak at their first meeting. The club meeting was held in the school library, a cozy space filled with eager faces. Lillian stood at the front of the room, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "When I was your age," she began, "I didn't think I had a voice. I thought the world was too big, too set in its ways for someone like me to make a difference. But what I've learned is that change doesn't start with big moments. It starts with small ones. A kind word, a helping hand, a willingness to stand up when something feels wrong. Those small moments add up." The students listened intently, their expressions a mixture of admiration and resolve. As Lillian finished speaking, Emma stood and led the group in a round of applause. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lillian sat with Gloria in the conference room of the community center. The room was quiet now, the echoes of earlier discussions fading into stillness. Gloria set down her pen and looked at Lillian with a smile. "You've come a long way," Gloria said. "Do you realize how many people you've inspired?" Lillian shook her head, a modest smile tugging at her lips. "I wasn't trying to inspire anyone," she said. "I just wanted to sit down. And that's what makes it so powerful," Gloria replied. "You didn't set out to be a symbol. You just stood up for what was right, and people saw themselves in you." Lillian nodded, her mind drifting to George and the life they had built together. He had always believed in her strength, even when she doubted it herself. "I just hope I'm making a difference," she said softly. "You are," Gloria said firmly. "More than you know." As Lillian left the community center that night, she paused to look up at the stars. The journey hadn't been easy, and the road ahead would undoubtedly hold new challenges. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly living her purpose, turning pain into progress, adversity into advocacy. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The ripple she had started was becoming a wave, and she was ready to ride it, no matter where it led. The morning was quiet as Lillian Baker sat on her porch, the first rays of sunlight painting the world in soft hues of gold and orange. She held a steaming cup of tea in her hands, the warmth a welcome contrast to the crisp air. The city around her seemed to exhale, its usual bustle muted for just a moment. Today felt different, not because there was a rally to attend or a meeting to lead, but because it was the first day in weeks that she had set aside for herself. She needed the space to reflect, to let the whirlwind of recent months settle into a quiet sense of purpose. Her thoughts turned to the ripple effect her actions had set in motion. The young mother fighting for her son, Emma Green starting her school club, the transit authority beginning to implement meaningful reforms, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle coming together. Each one linked to that singular moment on the bus when she decided she would not move. Her phone buzzed on the side table, breaking her reverie. She reached for it, her lips curving into a smile as she saw the name on the screen. It was Monica, her eldest daughter. "Good morning, Mama," Monica said, her voice warm and bright. "Good morning, sweetheart," Lillian replied. "How are you?" "I'm good," Monica said, "but I wanted to check on you. How are you feeling?" Lillian paused, letting the question settle. "Grateful," she said finally. "A little tired, but grateful." Monica chuckled. "You've been doing so much. It's okay to rest, you know?" "I know," Lillian said, "but there's still work to be done." "And you'll get it done," Monica said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. We all need you." Lillian's chest tightened, her love for her family filling her heart. "Thank you, Monica," she said softly. "I'll remember that." Later that day, Lillian decided to visit the community center. Though she had no official meeting scheduled, it felt like the right place to be. As she walked through the familiar halls, she noticed a group of young people gathered in one of the rooms. The door was ajar, and she recognized Emma standing at the front, leading a discussion. Curious, Lillian stepped closer, listening as Emma spoke with confidence. "We can't just talk about change," Emma was saying. "We have to make it happen. That means standing up, even when it's scary, and looking out for each other." Lillian felt a surge of pride. She hadn't planned to go inside, but Emma spotted her through the open door and waved her in. "Mrs. Baker," Emma called, her face lighting up. "Come join us." The group turned to see Lillian, standing in the doorway, their faces bright with recognition and admiration. Feeling both honored and a little shy, Lillian stepped inside. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice soft. "You were doing a wonderful job." Emma grinned. "You're not interrupting. You're the reason we're here." Lillian looked around the room, taking in the eager faces of the students. "Then I'm honored to be here," she said. "Thank you for carrying this forward." As the afternoon wore on, Lillian found herself energized by the students' enthusiasm. They shared ideas for projects, peer mentoring programs, anti-bullying campaigns, and community outreach initiatives. Each idea was a testament to their commitment to building a better world, one step at a time. Before she left, Emma handed Lillian a notebook filled with handwritten notes from the group. "We wanted to thank you," Emma said, "for everything." Lillian accepted the notebook with trembling hands. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes filled with tears. Each note was heartfelt, expressing gratitude for her courage and the impact it had on their lives. "You've given me more than I ever gave you," Lillian said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." That evening, Lillian returned home to find an envelope waiting in her mailbox. It was from the Transit Authority. Inside was a formal letter announcing the establishment of the Oversight Committee she had helped create. It detailed the new measures being implemented and included a personal note from Sarah Chambers. "Mrs. Baker," the note read, "your courage and persistence have inspired us all. Thank you for holding us accountable and showing us what true leadership looks like. We will do our best to honor your legacy." Lillian read the letter twice, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She had never sought to be a leader, but life had a way of guiding people to unexpected places. In the weeks that followed, Lillian's role in the community continued to evolve. She spoke at schools, attended rallies, and met with city officials to discuss broader issues of equity and inclusion. Each step was a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing, but it was also a celebration of how far they had come. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, she thought about George. She could almost hear his steady voice, reminding her of the strength she had always carried. "I hope you're proud of me," she whispered. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it a sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, Lillian felt the weight of her journey begin to lift. She had done more than stand her ground. She had built a foundation for others to rise. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, her phone buzzed with another message from Emma. "Mrs. Baker, our club voted on a new name today. We're calling it the Lillian Baker Initiative. I hope that's okay." Lillian stared at the screen, her throat tightening. She typed her reply carefully, her fingers trembling. "It's more than okay. It's an honor." As she set the phone down, she gazed out at the city, its lights twinkling like the stars above. She thought about the legacy she was building not just through her actions, but through the lives she had touched. The road ahead would still have challenges, but Lillian knew she wasn't walking it alone. She had a community, a purpose, and an unshakable belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could create waves of change. And in that moment, she knew the journey was only beginning. Thank you for joining us on Lillian's inspiring journey. Her story reminds us that one small act of courage can create waves of change, and that kindness and persistence have the power to shape a better world. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content that uplifts, inspires, and celebrates the human spirit. Together, let's continue spreading messages of hope and resilience. Thank you for watching.